an open session where we continue the conversation for you, with us, all of us. We've put in the program a bunch of like totally difficult questions that no one can answer. But honestly, we just want to continue this discussion, and of course we'll continue it over cocktails soon as well. Does anyone want to jump in? Start us off here.
I could answer all the questions.
Huh?
I could answer all the questions.
all?
The answer is pie.
Our student panel? You're here. Oh, good, because you were the one that I was thinking of. Yes. So, can I bring up a question that actually Kate and I were talking about a little bit, which is, I had at least suggested, and I think Kate agreed, that maybe we need to spend a moment defining what we mean by pleasure and what we mean by danger. Like, because we keep using these words, and danger especially, I think, has shown a certain amount of slippage, right? But also, I mean, that original moment was really partly because of its nearness to the whole kind of SM debates and everything. Like, that really was fairly particularly about sex and sexuality, right? I mean, pleasure, that's the kind of pleasure we were talking about. But I'm just wondering if that's still, like, I don't know, these are big words that we just keep using, and I'm wondering if anyone wants to give them any content.
I just want to share sort of a story in organizing this. When I reached out to the students to organize a student panel, and for those of us that are on the planning committee who were there when we first were pitching the title, we had this moment where I sort of admitted, thinking I was the only one, like, I don't know what that means. Like, what the heck does pleasure and danger mean? And they're like, oh, you know, it's this seminal text, and I'm like, well, I read a lot of feminist texts during my education in feminist studies, and I never had heard of it. So we immediately realized that there was sort of this maybe generational gap in like what the seminal feminist texts even were. So then when I emailed the students, right, so like another like removed. I emailed the students and asked them, and the first student I met with was Sonia, who has left now. But Sonia came into my office and they said, you know, I talked to the other students about this, and the first question was, so is it like about what's that movie, Grey?
50 Shades of Grey.
Like, you know, like what is the pleasure? You know, and there was definitely. Even I then, as like sort of a second year coming into it, had a hard time explaining to the students like what this concept is in terms of how broadly or how narrowly we are defining what pleasure and danger is. So it's funny that now we're at the last panel and we're still like,
what is pleasure? Oops, sorry.
Look, I mean, as someone of the older generation here, I actually want to make a case for its continued relevance as a couplet, I have to say, because I think our conversation here has expressed that very well. That certainly that phrase, pleasure, danger, and the volume, and then Powers of Desire, which was another book that came out around the same time, were about some specific things, about particular things around the sex wars, a lot around S&M, and a lot around sexual violence. And one of the things, there's a couple of interesting things that when we planned this for the Science special issue, a number of things came up, and for the panel. One was that it was still, in some ways, even more so now, much easier to talk about the danger, to talk about the violence, to talk about the fear, because that was some of the question I was asking the students earlier, because that seems some of the political organizing. When we talk about this sort of ferment of political organizing on campuses now, it is so much around pushing back, fighting back against sexual violence on campuses in particular, but in a broader context as well. But part of what was interesting to me about the trope, about the pleasure, danger, bad marriage that they have, is that I do think that's remained a conundrum that has followed feminism from its earliest days. How to have freedom from sexual violence and have a discourse about freedom from sexual violence simultaneously with a freedom for sexual desire and pleasure, and freedom for bodily integrity, and all that goes with it. And one of the things that has plagued feminist theoretical work and feminist theoretical and feminist practice as well, has been that those conversations have often been at odds and separate conversations, which is why we tried to bring them together. In other words, conversations about sexual violence and preventing sexual violence and fighting sexual violence, and conversations about sexual pleasure and desire and embracing, you know, our bodies and whether it's SM debates or conversations. Do you see what I'm saying? So part of what I was in thinking this, and for Carla and I in thinking of the special issue for Signs, was, is there a way, both theoretically and when we think about the politics of feminism, is there a way to find, to not just bridge them in some simplistic way, but is there a kind of theoretical conversation we can have that actually doesn't participate in that kind of binary discussion? Does that make any sense? I mean, so I think that was, is that accurate, Carla, with some of our thinking about that?
It is, and I would just add that the couplet has a particular force, and it had a particular historical force about sexuality and in the sex debates. But it also has a historicity, just to underscore what Susanna was saying, in terms of the sort of dual agendas of an historical feminist project that has always been as much about trying to find ways to attend to pleasure in all its meanings of freedom to, and danger in all its meanings of freedom from, and in fact in the non-sexual arenas, if there is any such thing, and I frankly don't think there is, or should be, but you know, the very same issues, terms like consent and contract, have been as fundamental to the so-called non-sexual, right, as to this couplet in its historicized sexualized arena. So part of what we were hoping to do was to find a couplet with the power to speak to an historical moment in second wave feminism, but also to a kind of history of major issues and major tensions. And one of the things I've loved so much about the discussion today is how much those major tensions have been on the table in a really good way. So yeah, I'm agreeing with everything you say.
That's what we do.
Just a quick point. I think it's interesting. So I'm a student studies anthropology. I spent time in India working on menstrual hygiene management and stigmas against menstrual hygiene in India. And I guess applying that sort of to pleasure and stigma within ideologies of body, and how that may apply to the work that all of you are doing and within the sort of framework of pleasure and danger, and how overcoming stigma or shame or social taboos can be extremely empowering. And I saw that working with 13-year-old girls in India. That was like my highlight. And sort of ways that positivity, sex positivity and enthusiastic consent, and the nuances and the weirdness of sex can be celebrated when focusing less on the danger of it.
Laura?
I'm absolutely, this is the last thing I'm going to say. I know I'm being bad, but I find myself actually getting quite head up about this. And in contradistinction to Carla, I would really like to make the case that sex, let me start again. There are many, many other realms of pleasure in the world than sex, and there are many, many forms, including gendered pleasure, whatever that would mean. And there are many, many forms of violence against women or gendered violence that are not sexual. So I guess my question is, and it's actually, and now this is making me realize one of the things that troubles me about the ways in which the kind of Title IX conversation has gone, and the way in which it's constructing students on campus, is that, when I do remember something about my college years, and many of the pleasures of discovery were not organized around sex or gender. I mean, some of them were, and they were always experienced by a sexed and gendered body, but actually, I did not spend most of my campus career having sex. So, I know I'm just wondering if anyone else feels that there might be other ways to take the concept of pleasure or danger.
So this is my last time too.
Okay.
I thought it was really interesting that when Susanna and Libby both sort of challenged the student panelists to talk more about pleasure, they all talked about like the pleasure of the relationships and
Yes.
organizations and the pleasure of being an activist and organizing, and they didn't talk about sex, which I know they're good students, so they all read the descriptions, they were there all day, they heard other people talk about sex, and maybe it's awkward if you're a student to talk about sex in front of your like, you know, maybe that's why they didn't talk about sex, but I actually think that you're right, that like the concept of pleasure extending to, it can still be a very bodily experience and not be sort of in how even are we defining sex, like, you know, so I thought that was interesting.
Maya?
Well, I also heard the students talk about, take it differently. I think it was Sydney on the end who was like, but I do think people talk about pleasure and they talk about it or know it in terms of Beyonce, who is a very sexualized feminist figure. And I think that is really interesting because there's something about the way that sex, even when reimagined in this feminist world, still draws on perhaps people's understandings of men and women in a dyad, which was something that came up before, that it's heterosexual sex that we've been talking about most of the time when we think about pleasure and danger, which doesn't really get to what's happening for queer, non-binary people whose ideas of pleasure and danger are not incompatible or not, but somehow still on the margins of the conversation and not really able to get centered.
Yeah, and along those lines, I also heard something else in terms of going to like kind of connect what Moya and Sarah are saying, in terms of the pleasure and danger, that conversation, we were all like, what? Like, we didn't read that. Part of it was because some of us were trained in the politics of the erotic, right? And how the erotic was came from much more a multiracial feminism of the second wave or the second wave, right? Rather than the pleasure and danger couplet. And so in my mind, what I heard some of the students say, I think it was Danielle, and they said that what they found pleasure in was the potlucks, was the community, was the healing. And in my mind, that speaks more to the erotic of the margins and the erotic of healing and the erotic of and that kind of like that erotic healing spiritual pleasure that we've also missed in this conversation.
Kate, I think it's not, by the way, so I'm trying.
As one of the students, I actually feel like what has been said by Moya and Julie is a more eloquent version of what I could ever describe, so thank you.
Yeah, look, there's no pleasure in potluck, I just gotta say that. That's a low bar. But also, I do think part of the part of the discourse, and when we were chatting about this earlier, is that I do think that there's a way in which some of the focus that we have had politically now on sexual violence, particularly on campuses, has disenabled a kind of discourse about a robust sexual pleasure, and has turned it into, in some ways, a discourse about safety.
Yeah.
And that pleasure is found in safety. Now, I don't think that's untrue in the sense that I think for when you feel vulnerable, there is a pleasure in safety. But the idea that social movements, that the end result of social movements, and that the end result of a feminist movement is a safe space, right? Is to me, talk about, that's an even lower bar than potluck, right? Jen, is that what I'm saying? You might want to follow
Yeah,
up.
I just want to follow up on that. I want to be clear that the particular pleasure that I was after was not sexual exactly. It was pleasure in learning, and I raised that because there we were with a panel of people who are paying like what $48,000 a year or something now to what I don't know what you guys are paying now, but a lot of money. To learn something, and what I hear mostly, and not just from them, but I hear this from my own students a lot, and it's something I'm constantly feeling I'm pushing back against, is a plea for recognize me and keep me safe. And everybody needs recognition, and everyone needs to be kept safe, but I wanted to ask them to see something else there too that they might be on a quest for, which is give me a place to take a risk and learn something for my 45 grand a year.
I don't want to push the conversation in a different direction, but I had a thought about when people were talking about why the narrative turned into this focus on danger and not pleasure, right? And I think we're missing maybe a part of the argument here in that it's easier for us to talk about sex as dangerous, right? Because it falls into the continuing sort of logic that women's sexuality is vulnerable, women's sexuality is something to be protected, women's sexuality is something that's fragile, and that sex for women is a violation of some sort. And it's very difficult for us to focus on the pleasure part, because then we have to acknowledge that women are sexual beings that have pleasure, that have sort of sexual desires and wants and whatnot. And that's a really difficult bar, I think, to move to get us to talk about pleasure rather than sort of the danger of sex. And how do we get to that in today's sort of continuing to in today's environment where sex for women still is a very, very hot issue to discuss publicly, at least,